Welcome to Still Growing in Grace. I'm Mike Zanker. Join me and other amazing guests as we explore and discover better, hope-filled perspectives on biblical texts and difficult themes. Prepare to expand your understanding of God's love and amazing grace. Growing in Grace Ministries Canada and Hope Fellowship, as well as Eastside Church, invite you to enjoy today's program as we dig deeper into what it means to be still growing in grace. Well, good morning and welcome to Still Growing in Grace. Great to have you with me this morning. It is Wednesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you're watching, make sure you make a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. That really helps sometimes. I hope you're enjoying this new series on atonement. The previous one was a more hope-filled perspective on hell. And that was pretty interesting. It went all over the place in a really good way. This one as well is going to go there. And today's topic is one of my favorites. It took me a while to absorb this one, not today, but when I first started to be exposed to reconsidering and revisiting this topic of Jesus was not forsaken on the cross, but he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Therefore, see, there's the big catch line, he was forsaken. Well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe there's better news. Maybe our concept of who we think God is can actually get better, because mine is, and it still is. I am unlearning so much, and I love it. And I guess the stuff that I'm unlearning wasn't helpful or true to begin with. It was often part of a fear system or a control system, and I'm finding God's love and agape so much more as I study deeper and deeper. So let's get into this conversation. I think you're going to love it. Here we go. Part one. Now, this is part three of the atonement, but it's part one of a two-part on forsaking. It's going to take 2 weeks to talk about this one. Here we go. All right, welcome back to Still Growing in Grace. And if you're following along in this new series, we're talking about atonement. What is it? How do we understand it? Why is it an important topic? And it's been fun. The last two conversations, we're just beginning to unpack it. But at the end of the last one, either on air or afterwards, we were chatting about a topic connected to it. It has to do with, did the Father forsake the Son? And I have a hunch. This is a big category that people don't think about. It's subliminal in many ways. And if you've never considered thinking it through, then this might raise some eyebrows, but I also think it's important to talk about, to unpack, because it's falsely attached to a pretty nasty atonement theory. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this forsaken. Have you guys dealt with it in your circles? When did you first kind of have to think about this? When were you forced to face this? So help me out, guys. Where are you guys at in this journey? And then we'll dive into it.
You go for it, Randy. You take it first.
Okay. All right. Well, several years ago, I had to, in this journey, this grace journey of the goodness of God, at some point you're going to cross this. What is the atonement and what it's all about? Because the dominant theory out there puts God in a very ugly light, in the sense that he was angry at mankind. He was angry at humanity, and the atonement was all about appeasing this angry God. When you hear that, you think about Molech, and they throw the virgin into the volcano to appease the angry God, and so this sounds kind of like that when you boil it all down. But the truth is, that's only one atonement theory. There's numerous atonement theories out there, and so I started looking around and seeing what was out there, and I found several things that made sense. A lot of them you can bunch together. They all sort of have a similar theme, and they don't have this angry God being appeased by a human sacrifice, and so it's quite different. As a matter of fact, they don't have a violent God at all. J. Denny Weaver, I was just reading one of his books, talks about the nonviolent atonement and how, what Jesus did to bring us salvation, to purchase humanity, was in no way an act of violence on his part or on the part of his father. It was an act of violence on the part of humanity by all means, but it was that's where the violence ended. So my I don't think my journey is finished yet. I'm still this atonement thing, but I'm not where I was, and I like where I'm headed. So I'm very excited about these conversations we've been having about atonement, and I'm learning some things.
That's cool. That's fun to hear you say you're still learning stuff, because people often assume that a program like this, all the people chatting have arrived at this. But I think we're learning as we're going too. And, watching some of your eyebrows go up and down, like Richard's not here, but once in a while I'll see his eyes go, and it's really fun. So, okay, what's he thinking? And he brings a different spin, and each of us adds some color to this conversation. So Bill, give us a quick intro.
Yeah, I mean, I think atonement's one of those things. I'm not sure, and I'm guessing you may be the same, both of you, how much it affected my understanding of God until I really knew what it was. And it's one of those things we don't talk about. You might hear the word, and you might kind of hear it applied in a Bible verse.
It's not a coffee shop topic, right?
It's not. And honestly, going through a decade now of re-understanding a lot of different things, and re kind of orienting how I see God, how I understand Jesus, it's come to light in my own mind how atonement, and this may be a kind of egregious statement, but how I don't think atonement's even understood by the average pastor. It's in so many ways, atonement is an indoctrination.
As a pastor joins the conversation,
as the two pastors on there, and you two are exceptions because you've kind of had to reevaluate as well. But so much of this is what we believe, toe the line. This is your filter for how to understand God. Don't deviate it. And that filter has really been centered around this idea that Jesus has on the cross become the sin of mankind, right? And God, in his purity and his glory and his holiness, doesn't have the ability to look upon sin or be around or impacted by sin. So God rejects Jesus because he takes on the sin of humanness. And God, turns his back and separates himself from the Son and pours his wrath on Jesus on the cross. And
like a punching bag.
In this moment, we have atonement because God's bloodthirst is satisfied by taking his vengeance and his violence and his necessity for this scales to be balanced, for the sins of all of Adam to be blood purged by the perfection of Jesus, who now has become sin. And we get this, and the irony is it's totally biblical. Totally.
That's scary.
I mean, we see this thing repeated from the very first elements of humanity all the way back, Abraham being the kind of first thing of this. And so this idea of sacrifice and sin is definitely a biblical theme. I think the challenge is we are confronted with the divinity of Jesus in the same moment. And I think that's what we need to wrestle through today is what does the divinity of Jesus tell us? If God can separate and turn his back on his son, then is Jesus truly divine or not? And I think for me,
that
was one of my aha moments, or that was one of my moments where I said, whoa, I gotta stop and pause on this. So I got a couple other things teed up here for later in the conversation, but I think there's a couple linchpins that are literally this entire penal substitution atonement theology, right? Penal punishment, substitution, Jesus takes our place, atonement, right? So there's a punishment of Jesus who takes our place. That's what that means. PSA, you may hear it. It hangs on fishing line thread with its viability, with like 2 or 3 verses in the Bible, out of context verses, mind you. Other than that, it really doesn't hold water. But man, we've stretched those strings to the limits, I think, corporately. And it's still a very, very strongly held presupposition by, I think, the vast majority of Western churches mostly Catholicism to a large degree, probably not as concrete there, but most of the Protestant branches have that baked in through the Reformation.
So, Fred, we're just kind of doing our intro of how we've had to face this God forsook Jesus thing and turns back, and we're just kind of chatting through our backgrounds of what we've been exposed to. So, you've been doing this for a while. So, from a pastoral lens, when did you have to face this and revisit it?
I think I mentioned on our first, when you and I did a little conversation, just us, I have what, it's kind of the Mount Rushmore of kind of a shift in theology, that 4 big ideas, and hell was the first for me, but atonement was the second one.
Mm.
And I grew up with this separation, penal substitutionary, very awkward name of penal substitutionary atonement. So that's why I understood it. God was always angry, couldn't look upon sin. I agree with what Bill said there toward the end. I'll take it a step, maybe a little bit further. The idea of the separation of the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
I think this, to be honest with you, I think that borders on heresy.
Yeah, I'd agree.
That's only if you don't think about it.
Well, and again, they try to play mind games and word games and not address it. Yeah. At least in my experience, the true rift in the Trinity is never really brought up, because I think you're right. I think that by nature, you can't address it, because then you have to address it. So if you just ignore it, it's a lot easier than addressing it.
Right.
Yeah, I don't see many talking about it.
No, you just ignore it.
Just ignore it. Just ignore it. But pastorally speaking, I wish that somebody would do a work, maybe it's out there and I haven't seen it, of the psychological, emotional, even physical, if you will, aspect or result of viewing God in this particular lens,
the
this
trauma,
angry, retributive God, because I honestly think it's impacting people in ways we are not aware of. Yep. So I do think this is vitally important doctrinal challenge for us. I will say this also: whenever you approach this to an Western evangelical crowd, which I did, I've never had this happen before, even in the whole hell thing. But I was preaching one Sunday, and I was explaining this to the congregation, and a guy stood up in the middle of the crowd, and we had a good crowd, and he just yelled at me and challenged this. I mean, it really angered him. This is embedded in the minds of many.
This is deeply enrooted.
Yep.
It really is, and we, in sharing and our ideas about this, language is important, and we have to try to say, hey, here's a different way that the early church has viewed what happened on the cross, this mysterious event of what's actually happening there. But one thing real quick, and I'll stop, is that here's what I ask people, and I did with many of our people that came and challenged this idea. They said, so if God is being satisfied by the torture of his son, when does he start to feel relief?
Mm.
Is it on the 10th lash? Is it the shoving of the crown of thorns on his head? Is he starting to relieve some of his anger? At what point of the beating and torture of his son does he release his anger? And I haven't heard a real good response to that.
Mm.
As if did it take all 39 stripes? Was that required for God to relieve his anger? Was it, what part of it, all of it? I guess I say all of that because I think there's a point to this where it becomes a tad bit absurd.
Yeah.
If we can arrive at absurd, I don't think people realize how deeply entrenched it is, because if you're churched, you go to church on Easter, do the Good Friday thing. You watch the Jesus of Nazareth movie series. You watch all those shows, and if you're Catholic or not Catholic, you watch The Passion with Mel Gibson's rendition of beat the daylights out of Jesus, and he bleeds more blood than a human possibly has in their body. And it's all about the blood. It's gore. So and violence is worshipped. They don't know that, but it's so connected to the Old Testament that they have this underlying belief in my mind. The Old Testament's completely true. Therefore, all of this is also true. Therefore, we cannot challenge it. So these conversations that we're having, I think, are giving people permission to challenge them and rethink.
Yeah.
This is not a new concept. What we're talking about is a new menu item for you, maybe, but it's not new. Some of the little elements of truth that we hear in our conversation, I might hear something really new, which I have. It's like, okay, that's new to me. A great way to frame that. I'd never heard it like that before, but it's not even new to the person saying it because somebody else shared that. And so this is we're visiting a more ancient concept of what really happened at the cross. And as Richard Murray keeps bringing up, this is about establishing the nature of God.
Yeah.
Like every answer we have is a reflection of how we perceive God and how we perceive ourselves every time. That includes all the big topics we've talked about.
Yeah. Interestingly, and this is probably a different topic, maybe the next topic even. What the challenge, I think, with penal substitution atonement theology really boils down to is the reality that our flesh, to use that word, our humanness, our created animalistic mortal beingness, right? Survival, like the primal things that are within us that are, I think, hard to describe, sees and resonates with penal substitution and has for every human since the dawn of man. And this is wrapped up in a new atonement theory called mimetic theory. We can talk about that more in depth. And I think the challenge with displacing penal substitution atonement theology as the boilerplate filter for how people understand the story of Jesus, how people understand the story of Scripture, people understand their own personal stories. It's like trying to rip off the alien, that's planting the seed, the parasite, the symbiote inside of you. Like this thing's latched on, and it's like ripping a part of ourselves away to try and see it from a different angle, to realize that part of us, just like I said earlier, is biblical, is true from our nature, our flesh nature, not our spirit nature, our flesh nature. And Jesus and God uses that story to reveal himself anew in a completely unexpected and almost transcendently opposite manner.
Yeah.
And that's what we're wrestling with here, that God is the exact opposite of that. But removing that thing from our minds, ripping that alien off of our face is hard. I mean, it's really hard. And like I said, I think what we do and what we've seen happen with the religious paradigm shift from 500 years ago with the Reformation, where this thing kind of took over en masse, is we went searching for scriptures to prove, the presupposition that has to be what God's like. Because we started with this very victorious understanding of Jesus, and we just started migrating back to like almost a pre-Judaism understanding of God, that God is this holy thing, and we got to go back to the temple, and we got to cut, sheep up and bleed sheep on an altar. That's what they believed, right? And now we're back to that, and we just kind of substitute Jesus for the sheep, and we're believing the same thing that these ancient blood sacrificing primitive people believed. We just think we got kind of the ultra lamb, and we don't have, but the process and the God hasn't changed one iota from what they believed prior to Jesus. So that's the symbology going on to try and give maybe context if you're trying to understand what we're trying to describe. I think it's hard. I just figured I'd throw out my understanding of the verse is that this thing's linchpinned on. It's really 3 or 4 verses in all of Scripture. If you even put these verses in context, it starts to crumble instantly. It really does. A couple of them are the same verse, but you have Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34. These are Jesus on the cross. And Jesus on the cross starts by saying, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? And so right there, people are like, Jesus said it, it's got to be true, end of story. And then this thing kind of evolves. But Jesus is also quoting that same verse, which happens the third time from Psalms 22, verse 1. So that's the opening of Psalms 22, verse 1. And then the other verse that's, I think, been correlated and tried to kind of graft into this is, of all random verses, throw a dart on a big giant Bible, Habakkuk 1:13.
I was wondering if
right?
you're going to do that one. Yep.
Yeah. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil, and you cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Of course, we don't say the second half of the verse. We only are going to use the first half of the verse.
Yeah.
So we take God abandoned Jesus on the cross. He said it. It's got to be true. We take Habakkuk 1:13, half a verse, and boom, penal substitution is strong. Is biblical. You can't deny the Bible. Boom, we're done, and it's over. So I'll stop from there because I think you guys can kind of break those verses down. I'm guessing just as well as I can.
Sure. Throw the
Can I
hand
add
grenade
one
into
more?
us.
Oh, yeah, one more. Okay.
Let me add one more that was big in my childhood, and it's Isaiah 59, verse 2, which for some reason the print is smaller than it used to be. But it says, but your iniquities have separated you from your God.
There it is. It's a good
Your
one.
sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear. And then again, it's like the Habakkuk passage. You just stop there.
Stop. Can't read on.
Yeah. So if you go through that passage, I think.
Same thing with
circle-
Psalms 22. Just stop. Just don't keep
Stop.
going.
Yeah. I think it's, verse 15 and 16 talks about how he's looking. There it says he's hidden his face, he's not looking. But if you read it a little later, it's
In
very
Psalms
similar.
22?
Well, in Isaiah's 59.
In Isaiah, yeah.
Psalm 22 does the same thing.
It's verse 24.
Yep.
Yeah, he says, I won't turn my back on the suffering.
Yeah. Verse 1 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Last verse 24, for he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard.
And how about crying out? Go ahead, Randy.
Oh, thank you. I think, that verse where Jesus cries out, he's on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think it's Brad Jerzak that talks about how, Jesus, all of his life, he was taking on himself, humanity. He was living out humanity. It was God living out humanity. And that moment on the cross when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was entering into the human delusion, the delusion that humanity has been forsaken. And so
Which is the becoming of sin.
I'm sorry?
Which is the becoming of sin.
Exactly. So he entered into that delusion that, we live in a God-forsaken world and a God-forsaken life, and God's out there, he's mad at us, he's distant, all of these deceptions. At that moment, Jesus entered in to our deception. And so he cries out that way because he was feeling what humanity feels.
Yeah, and then he ends that by quoting another passage from Psalm, into your hands I commit my spirit. So obviously he didn't feel completely abandoned.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He comes through it. I've taught it and heard it taught this way, and I believe it to be true. I believe that Jesus is obviously recalling. People of that culture would have had Psalms memorized. These were songs.
Yep.
And I think Jesus is quoting the entirety of Psalms to himself, 22. I do. I think he's including the entirety of Psalms, because if you even go to the very last verse of Psalms 22, a perfectly appropriate translation is, "It is finished."
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And I think that is the book ending. That verse, "It is finished," Telestai, is the book ending of Jesus's Aramaic vernacular when it comes to Psalms 22. And then he goes into another Psalms. And one of the most beautiful things, and I'm not going to do it today, but think about it. We put our chapters, we put our verses in, right? We do all that, but that's not how their scrolls would have read.
Right.
What's the verse after? The exact one is, "They will come to declare his righteousness to a people who will be born. He has done this." That's the last verse in Psalms 22. Next verse, next chapter, Psalms 23, verse 1.
yeah, the Lord is my shepherd.
"The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down." In other words, I'm not abandoned. I have a shepherd as I go into paradise.
And into the valley,
And,
or through the valley. of the shadow
or
of
through the
death.
gates of hell to
Yeah.
redeem it, which probably are the same thing if we're being honest.
Right.
Right?
You know, one thing that I also studied about and read about the culture that Jesus was brought up in and was raised is that mothers, as they pillowed their children at night, prayed over them, "Into your hands I commit my spirit."
Mm,
And so as Jesus looks down at his mother, watching him, he's recalling those prayers over him by her,
wow.
in that mind to commit your spirit into the hands of your Father. And I think that came back to play on the cross as well. Also, John chapter 16, Jesus is talking about to the disciples, and he said, "You're all going to forsake me." I think in John 16, "You're all going to forsake me, but my Father's not forsaking me."
Mm-hmm.
So he was recognizing prior to the cross that my Father's going to be with me.
Yeah, so back to the whole point of this idea that God can't look upon sin, Habakkuk, right? The second half of the verse is, "So why do you look
So
upon sin?
why are you doing it?
Why do you continue to do this?" My interpretation, Habakkuk, the author, is, you should be too holy to look upon
Right. Right.
our depravity, our meekness, our littleness with your greatness, and yet you do these things. What kind of God are you?
Mm.
And I think that is just, once you see that, once you get the repentance, the changing of mind of Habakkuk, we're called to do the same thing, and now use Jesus as that exact representation of God on the cross. God, that's the perfect image of God. That's not the God abandoning Jesus. That's God revealing himself through Jesus.
I love
Yes.
that revelation.
That's a different atonement. And like Fred said, it's a dangerous one, though, because a lot of people just, that's a barrier they have not been able to get through.
But it's like these old hymns. We hear the hymns, that saved a wretch like me. You don't question that stuff. It's just ingrained in you. So when we have this, my God, why have you forsaken? We assume much because we go with the tradition of our traditions. But
Mhm.
a close look shows us the Messianic Psalms, especially 22, 23, and 24. They're a revelation of the love of God.
Yeah.
And Jesus relied on them. So I don't think he felt abandoned. I think he was declaring to all the listeners, this is it. Like right now, this is the time. I don't know. We got to move on to the next one. So let's catch up on the next part 4, the next time we have a conversation. Thanks for watching, everyone. Alrighty, I hope you enjoyed that pretty good conversation. I love that. And obviously next week we'll do part 2 of that, which is really part 4 in the Atonement series. We have 9 parts of the Atonement, and I think it's deep. It's going to cover a lot of categories, and I hope it'll be meaningful to you. All right, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you are enjoying it, let us know. If you feel like contributing to help us keep going with this, because it costs to air this on the Grace Awakening Network that we're on every Wednesday night. Where they're live with the TV station, which is on Roku and the website. Links are below in this recording. So go take a look. And until next week, have a fantastic week. We'll catch you then. Join me next time on Still Growing in Grace. Enjoy previous episodes by downloading our podcast at growingingrace.ca. If this show's been an encouragement to you, consider making a donation today. For our Canadian link, visit growingingrace.ca, and for our USA link, visit eschurch.com. Your donation will help us continue spreading really good news. Thank you again for tuning in to Still Growing in Grace.